All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the State of Vegetation Management, Episode 4. My name is Gary Huntley, and it's my pleasure to host this webinar today. By way of background, I retired from Entergy a couple of years ago as Vice President of Distribution Services, and Vegetation Management was one of my areas of responsibility. In these series, we have different guests that come on and share their experiences in managing vegetation. And today we're fortunate to have Mr. Jacob Barlow. Jacob is from Randolph Electric Membership Corporation. And I'll give Jacob a moment here to give a little bit more of his background and tell us a little bit about your company.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Gary. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jacob Barlow. I'm the Senior Project Engineer here at Randolph Electric. We're a rural co-op. We serve parts of 5 counties right in central North Carolina: Randolph, Montgomery, Moore, Chatham, and Alamance counties. In North Carolina, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is, but in general, the way it works in North Carolina is Duke Energy owns the majority of the transmission, and then we take delivery from delivery points. We do own some transmission, but then we mostly own a lot of distribution lines that go through the different counties. Just some background on North Carolina. I'm not sure where everybody's from, but this is a heavily forested area. North Carolina is number 11 on the most forested states in the United States of America. So we're not number 1, certainly, but we're up in the top part of that percentile. There's approximately 18.8 million acres of forest in North Carolina, and that's about 60% of the total land area in North Carolina is forested. It is the second largest industry in the state, which contributes to about $3.2 billion annually. A lot of people, if you're east of the Mississippi, you probably use southern yellow pine. That's grown right here in the Randolph Electric Service Territory and our neighbors as well. A lot of that comes right out of here. So it's definitely something we face every day. It's a challenge for us. I like to joke, sometimes I feel like we're a right-of-way management company that also builds power lines occasionally. But it does seem that we spend a significant amount of time and effort trying to keep our trees trimmed back and clear of our lines.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate the introduction. And I also want to mention we have Eric Pelkey on the line, and Eric is assisting us with some of the technical details around hosting this webinar. So Eric, we appreciate you joining us today. So Jacob, tell me a little bit. So it sounds like your terrain, if you will, your environment is different than it is in other places across the country, right? I'm sure that there are some things that are going to sound very familiar to us. Can you tell us a little bit about the processes that you have for managing vegetation, be it circuit trim or if you're going to individual segments? How are you managing that vegetation around the power lines?
Yeah, certainly. So we do circuit-based cycle trim. That's our heaviest lift, and the most spend that we do is on a circuit-based cycle trim. We're somewhere, I think we average right around 7 years is what it takes us to get through a complete cycle. We have some feeders that are probably do better on a 6-year cycle, some that we can stretch out to 8 years. So probably on average, we're right around a 7-year cycle for everything. We generally try to follow an 8-year cycle, but we have, like I said, some where we'll move it up a year and some where we'll push it back a year, just based on resource availability and funds essentially that are available, as well as the actual condition of the trees. We've always stuck with a circuit-based approach. We've really kind of, in recent years, looked at doing a more segmented approach. There's just a lot of concerns around that. One of the big things we do as a co-op, is member engagement and making sure our member owners understand exactly what we're doing on the circuit, and that feeds their house and affects them. And when you go to a segmented approach, it becomes harder to manage that communication to the member to say, we're going to be out there on your circuit doing some trimming between this date and this date. We try to give them a heads up, let them know that it's coming. And if you're doing a segmented approach, it just adds a lot of burden to our internal personnel to try to keep up with that. Also, another concern about it, a segmented approach, ideally, it looks so attractive because you're thinking like, okay, we're only going to trim the parts of the circuit that really need it, and maybe we can stretch out our right-of-way dollars a little bit farther. But a lot of our contract costs are done by the circuit mile. And so that takes into account that these large right-of-way companies like Asplin and Xylem and Lewis Tree and all the companies out there, and I'm not trying to exclude anybody on purpose, just listen off who we normally deal with. They'll come out and ride the circuits to be able to provide their right-of-way pricing. And so they're taking into account that there's going to be portions of the circuit that are less strenuous for them to do and portions that are more strenuous. And it all averages out to a certain cost. Well, if you start going with a segmented approach, that average cost is likely going to rise because you're only going to be hitting the hardest parts of the circuit. Now, it may all balance out. I'm not sure. I've never run the numbers and tried to figure that out. Would it all balance out in the end? But also a couple other considerations to deal with a segmented approach is one of the big concerns we have with our contractors that they've shared with us, and not just our right-of-way crews, but even internally and with our contract crews that we use for line construction. CDL drivers are a premium these days. It's very hard for these companies to get and hold on to CDL drivers. And this big equipment you have to have a CDL driver to move this large equipment around. So if you start doing segmented trim, that just means that they're going to have a driver out there that's capable of moving that equipment from not just driving it down a right of way, but actually moving it from one location to another, which would probably increase the cost as well. And then also you lose flexibility for the contractor. Our circuit, we get a significant amount of rainfall. There's a lot of our line passes through front yards, backyards, just right away. So there's places that you can work when it's a little bit wet because it's high ground and it's in a right of way. And there's places that you can't work when it's wet, like somebody's front yard. And so if you were to go to a segmented approach, one of our concerns is that the contractor would lose that flexibility to be able to stay on one circuit and actually trim. So if it's a slightly rainy day like we've had this week, they can hit the high spots and still stay busy. Whereas if we just gave them like all kind of hard stuff, they may lose that flexibility on where they can send people. So with all that said, that's kind of led us down this path of sticking with a more circuit-based approach. And that's kind of where we've landed. And we don't really have much intention to change that anytime in the next 2 to 3 years at least.
Yeah, Jacob, so you raised some really good points. I think for a lot of utilities that are on a contract cycle, the way you describe it, it's probably better for them. And certainly while they're under that contract strategy, to keep it at the circuit level. I know that there are some utilities that have more of a sort of a T&E type rate. And those are the ones that I think that have been able to pivot towards the segmented basis for the reasons you discussed, right? So when I think about how these cycle trim is set and how you contract for that, essentially what you're doing is you're sort of buying insurance, right? You've got a 7-year cycle trim, I think is what you described. And then you've got contractors that are coming out, they're working that entire circuit. You're getting some sort of assurance, if you will, that entire circuit is going to be dealt with in a manner that's pleasing to you as far as reliability to meet some standard or your budget or whatever expectations that you have. But I think on the T&E level, if your contracts were set on that level, then you would have the flexibility to just go and hit certain parts of that circuit. And I think some utilities have done that. Can you tell me a little bit about the 7-year cycle? What drove you to get to a 7-year cycle? Is that budget related? Is it standards that you have? What factors went into Randolph Electric having a 7-year average cycle?
Yeah, it was part of it is just historic. A lot of trim cycles that utilities have, based on my personal experience, and then also talking to a lot of people that are in the industry. A lot of our trim cycles are inherited. It's just that's what we've always done as a company, and that's kind of where we were with our 8-year cycle. But recently we've partnered to do some more analysis around our right-of-way trim cycle, and that's where we've landed on based on the analysis that we're doing through AI Dash. That they take into account the growth rate of the trees. It was close to what we had originally planned for most of our circuits, but it did kind of indicate that a slightly more aggressive cycle would have a better impact on keeping the right of way managed, and which in turn would have an impact on our reliability statistics. So again, just to kind of recap, that is, we had an inherited trim cycle that we tried to verify with data, and then what we were able to find out through that verification process is that, hey, we need to be a little bit more aggressive than we have been in the past. So I just urge people to really take a close look at what their trim cycle is. Does it make sense? Are you spending a lot of money doing hot spot trimming and mid-cycle trimming? And if you are, maybe your overall trim cycle is not really where it needs to be from the start. And if you take a more holistic approach, looking at your cycle trim and your hot spot trimming and your mid-cycle work, does that lead to a picture where maybe you should be doing a more frequent cycle trim?
Okay. So Jacob, let's pivot. You mentioned something about having data and verifying the 8-year cycle, and you had more information. So where do you think the industry is going in terms of traditional cycle trim and right-of-way management? You talked about collecting information and you pivoted, sounds like you pivoted from what was historically an 8-year to a 7-year. So tell me where you think that's going and what helped you to get there in terms of a shorter cycle.
Yeah, I think just with the way technology is working now, whether it's using satellites or using LiDAR or using drone inspections, there's just so many more resources and ability to collect data on large swaths of the system than there ever has been. Like go back 20 years, and the only way people were collecting right-of-way data is to actually just ride it out and see what's going on. And we're in a different era now. We've crossed the threshold that it's easy to do these other types of inspections. It's definitely in the realm of possibility for most people. If you really looked at your budget on how much if you're paying a full-time person to ride out and inspect all the lines, that money could be potentially better spent on doing some kind of different inspection type. Like I said, like a drone inspection or a satellite inspection or some kind of LiDAR inspection. And you may even get better results. One of the concerns I always have, and when I've talked about this in the past, is we have this what I call a proximity bias to our system, right? So if I live on the system and when I drive home, I'm passing all our poles and wires on the way home and on a certain circuit. And so I look at that right away every single day. And when those trees start to encroach, it's like, oh, okay, I know we need to trim this. And the same thing is happening at various parts of the system. The parts that get frequented very often have what I call this proximity bias, in that we see it all the time. We know it needs to be trimmed, so we make sure that it's getting addressed. But that's only a very small percentage of the entire system. We're not driving by our poles every single day on a vast majority of the system. And so we got to be careful about just letting that proximity bias trim the same things over and over again when there's other parts of the system that are just in desperate need of additional trimming. And that's why I like the technology approach, in that it is an entire system scan. It doesn't leave any rock unturned, and it doesn't really care if this part of the system is driven out more than this part of this or that part of the system. And so it just comes down to a more holistic approach. That's not to say you could not achieve that with a guy in a truck, but the reality is some of our right-of-way is very hard to get to, and it may not even be vehicle accessible. So that productivity of that guy in that truck is going to be hampered in a lot of situations, where if he's got to get out and walk 2 miles of right-of-way, that might be all he gets done that day, or that might be all he gets done before lunch that day. And whereas if it's a more holistic approach, like a satellite program or a drone program, that might be something they could do in 10 minutes and be done.
Yeah. And so you raised an issue about accessibility. And so when I think about it, utilities have safety really as their number one issue for the employees and for the communities they serve, right? And so from a safety perspective, being able to remotely gather that data, you really do remove some of those safety risks that you have for people trying to get out and get in those areas as you described. What about the timing, right? So there's the time it takes to collect that information from a manual process, compared to a more automated process. What have you found in terms of maybe time saving, or you're just experiencing that?
Yeah, I mean, we've made a big push to try to get a better handle on our MidCycle program. Instead of doing hotspot trimming on this circuit, we try to get a better handle on that and make sure when we send a crew to a circuit, we're getting the whole thing. So just recently, we spent a good bit of time doing some hotspot checking and really data verification on a couple of our circuits that are kind of due for some mid-cycle trimming. And it really, in my experience, to do a very detailed, good ride out on one of our circuits. And I could pull up the circuit mileage, but I'm sure it's no different. From the substation, the last member is probably 10 to 12 miles away, and the circuit branches out in all different directions. So you're talking hundreds of miles of line for an individual circuit. That, to do a detailed inspection on that, you're looking at least 2 to 3 weeks probably of dedicated time, just one person writing that out, walking that out, making notes, all that stuff. So it takes a significant time investment to do that. And the reality is that with the technology that's available now through satellite, drone, or other, that's something that's can be done almost instantaneously, like, or in a very short order compared to an actual manual ride out.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of part of the overall process of putting together the work plan where you actually get the contractors out doing the work. Collecting the data is just one part of it, right? And you still have to analyze that data. And so when you have folks going out and taking notes and then having to pull together meetings for everybody to share their notes and then to get consensus on what it is that you want to do, every day of that really matters, right? I mean, the time, anything that you can do to shorten that overall process will help you to get contractors into the field a lot faster to get the actual work done, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and just the management of keeping up with that. But I mean, at the end of the day, this is very important for us. So most utilities are doing what it takes to get it done, not just Randolph Electric. We have a process in place. A lot of other utilities have their internal processes in place. It's just there's an opportunity there where maybe you can get a little bit more efficient than you have been in the past. And I don't know how most people are, but I always have more work than hours in the day to get it done. So anything that can improve my efficiency, that doesn't mean I'm just going to be sitting here doing nothing. It just frees me up to work on other stuff and keep up with other things that need attention as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the misnomers, I guess, around this new technology. I think a lot of people think we have arborists, we have foresters, we have folks who've been in this business and who truly are experts, right, at what they do. And I think sometimes we believe that new technology will put them out of work. I actually see this as being an opportunity for them to work faster and smarter in terms of what they do. You still need people who are very knowledgeable, who know about trees, know about how they grow and all those, the health of the trees, and able to analyze that data. I think you still need that expertise to be very highly effective at what you do in terms of vegetation management. I think, and you said it best, it's really being more efficient and effective at doing that with the new technology.
I would agree 100% with that. It's another tool in the toolbox is how people should look at it. Is they have whatever their workflow management system is. They have their chainsaw and their hooks and all their equipment that they got to do to get the job done. This is just another tool that will help. Instead of having to worry about an entire circuit, it will help target them to specific locations to say, hey, you don't have to ride this whole thing out. You just got to go check on these 4 or 5 spots and then make a decision on what you're going to do for those spots. And it just really helps target their time more effectively.
Yep. No, I totally agree. And so, Jacob, you mentioned mid-cycle trimming, and you made a couple of comments about that. Can you tell us a little bit more detail about your mid-cycle trimming program process and what you found and maybe some of the challenges?
Yeah, so for the way Randolph Electric does it is we do the cycle trim, and again, that's anywhere from a 6 to 8 year, depending on the circuit. Some circuits are 6, some are 7, some are 8. And in the mid-cycle, so halfway through, so somewhere between the 3 to 4 year range, we actually come back out and we spray the right-of-way. That's when we do our right-of-way spraying. And in those spray areas, we would go ahead and mow it. And that's also an opportunity to, at that point, you're going to start having yard trees. That we call them yard trees. These are in the front of somebody's house, in the middle of their yard. It's the trees that they plant directly underneath the power line in front of the house so that they have their privacy screen, or down their property line with their neighbor that grows up into the power line. In those, generally, they get topped right below the neutral. Ideally, we would just get rid of them. But again, it goes back to that privacy screen. People don't want to get rid of these. And then you may have dead trees as well. So since the last time you trimmed that circuit, our right-of-way crews are responsible for identifying dead trees just outside the right-of-way and taking care of those, the danger trees. But over a 2, 3, 4 year period, other trees are going to die and start becoming a problem. And you're not necessarily actively looking for those. But when you do come across them, or you do have a program that identifies those, they do need to be taken care of. So what we found is we put a lot of effort and spent a lot of time bouncing around to different sites, doing service orders that maybe a member called in and said, I can't see my street light because the tree's grown up into it, or my service is being engulfed by my yard trees, or whatever it is. Or just our linemen driving down the road doing their service work say, hey, this yard tree's up in there burning. And that starts to happen around that 3 to 4 year mark as that stuff grows back into the lines. And so we've started to push really hard this year to try to, when we send a crew into a circuit we'll pick the circuit that has the most service orders, or is the longest mid-cycle. So how long has it been since it's been trimmed and it's not due to be trimmed in the next couple of years? Those circuits right in that mid-cycle. And what we're trying to do is a more targeted approach and a more holistic approach on that circuit to say, when we send that crew there, we're going to hit as much stuff as possible. And then hopefully that circuit will be able to hold itself until the next, and maybe we'll have an occasional service order here and there, but we won't be spending a significant amount of time going back and trimming parts of that circuit. So like I said, it's something that we're pushing to really try to be a little more organized on where we send that crew and how much time they spend on the circuit, and really trying to get it up to par so that it'll last until the next cycle trim.
Yeah, it sounds like that's the opportunity for more of a segmented approach, right? I mean, for you to be able to get out and maybe have a more surgical sort of tactical approach to addressing those trees.
Yeah, and that's really being done with a crew, like you alluded to earlier, that's operating more on a time and equipment basis, that they're not locked into this large circuit schedule where we've provided we bid out 2 years worth of right-of-way. So it's 2 years worth of circuits that we bid out, and we tell them what year they got to do what circuits in. So those guys are kind of locked in trying to get those circuits done. This is a different crew altogether that is more on a T&E. So we're basically just sending them where we need to get work done on a daily basis or a weekly basis. And so that helps with that segmented approach, like you alluded to with the T&E.
Yeah, it sounds like in the past, we had sort of a one size fit all, right, in terms of a contracting strategy. And I think what I hear you say, and certainly has been part of my experience, is that you really can have both, right? You can have a combination of both that could work for you, right? And some of this depends upon the terrain that you have to manage. We've had other guests come on and that are in other areas that didn't have quite the density, perhaps, or the same type of vegetation that you had. And so they may have had a different approach, right, in terms of the way they manage vegetation. So I think a real big takeaway from this is that once you have the information, you really could do a combination of the managing by the entire circuit versus the segment. It may affect the way that you actually contract, right? Your contracting strategy for all this may change based upon those needs. It's pretty insightful.
I worked with a girl who came from a co-op in Kansas, and she said they don't have any right-of-way crews at all. They just have one guy that cuts trees, and every once in a while he'll get a couple of apprentice linemen to help him if he needs it. But in Kansas, there's no trees. So she was saying he was so slow that his work was actually to paint the office. And it's like, man, I just couldn't imagine living in a place where you don't have any right-of-way contract crews at all. Just such a different world. And the same thing in Iowa. I talked to a guy from Iowa one time, and he said the most common tree in his service territory is a 40 class 5 pole, because they don't have any trees. And it's just, I just asked him, I said, well, what causes your stuff to go out then? So it's just kind of funny how different co-ops are and different companies are and the challenges they face. We certainly, for us, trees, that's a large part of what we have to worry about on a daily basis. So it's the number one cause of outages in our service territory.
Absolutely. And I think that just basically proves that where you are and the type of vegetation you have really does matter, and that you could have a very wide variety of contracting strategies and
Yeah.
resources to manage that. So we've talked quite a bit now about inside of right-of-way, right? So can you tell me a little bit about your outside of right-of-way processes? What experience have you had in terms of outages out with trees outside of vegetation, outside of right-of-ways? And what are your processes around that?
Yeah, so we categorize anytime we have a tree outage, there's basically four pieces of information or two pieces of information we capture that there's kind of four choices on is was the tree inside the right of way or outside the right of way? And was it a green tree or a dead tree? So that's something that we closely track. And a significant number of our outages, I'd have to pull the stats. I didn't pull the stats specifically for that, but I know just from personal experience that a significant number of our outages are caused by dead trees outside the right of way that come in contact. So it's something that I've spoken to a lot of people from different utilities on this, and it seems to be a challenge from everybody that I've spoken to is how do you find those trees before they cause the outage? It's really easy to find them after they cause the outage. And everybody says, oh yeah, that would have been great to cut that tree. But at that point, it's too late. So I would love to, if somebody's got the smoking gun solution on how to handle that would be great. And that'd be worth a lot of money. So don't just tell people for free, make sure you sell that information. But for us, it is a continual challenge. We're always trying to improve on that. And we're always trying to think of ways to like just really harp on the linemen and the service trucks that if you see a dead tree, please make a note, report it. Don't just drive by it. Our guys are pretty good at that. But again, it goes back to that's going to be affected by that proximity bias. They're only going to be able to report on stuff that they're going by unless you make an active effort to try to go out there and find these trees. You're always going to struggle with this. So we haven't really come up with a good solution on that. We're hoping that the technology that we've partnered with will help provide additional information on dead and dying trees. So that way, at least it gives us areas to inspect, to go out there and say, hey, do we see anything here? That's one thing we're really excited about with the technology and hoping that it can improve that process for us. But it definitely is a challenge, and we don't have that part figured out quite yet. We handle it the best we can as we come across them. We make sure we identify them and get them cut down in a timely manner. But like I said, a significant number of our outages are still caused by these trees outside the right of way.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge, right? Because, and depending on where your right of way is, it could be even harder to get to those areas just outside of the cleared right of way that you have for your power lines. I think a lot of utilities also struggle from a budget perspective. We put a lot of time, money, effort into managing the right of ways. And so when you have limited budgets, you sort of prioritize and make sure that all of your money goes towards that. The one thing we both know is that customers, in your case, members, they really don't care what caused, whether the tree was inside the right of way or outside the right of way when the power goes out, right? I mean, from that perspective, when you're delivering that message, it just falls flat. It's like, hey, we did a really great job managing inside the right of way. But, this tree came from outside the right of way and caused the outage. Customers don't really care much about that at that point. I think
I agree.
From my personal experience, I think we've had success in managing the outside of right-of-ways by the use of technology. We had the same challenges that you and every other utility has. It's knowing about those trees is usually after the outage, right? And so that's sometimes you do know, and for the ones you find out about, you struggle with whether or not you have sufficient budget funds to really make a difference on that. So we were able to use satellite technology to identify very quickly where some of these trees were. And we were able to put those sort of in a geographical kind of a cluster, map those out, and then issue separate contracts to get those removed. And we did see some success in that. I don't know that you can 100% ever remove all those risks, because some of those are dependent upon the storms and weather and other things that may cause even healthy trees to become a problem for you. But we have had success in identifying the ones that were, I would say, imminent danger, right? We knew it was just a matter of time under the right conditions, not even the worst of storms, but just the right conditions, you would have that problem. So you mentioned earlier about the timeliness of collecting that information. I would say we found that the collection of that information was very cost efficient with satellite technology. And then Your challenge then becomes, once you have the information, do you have the resources to address that? So I think utilities are still going to maybe struggle with that a little bit, but I think as we have more information and as we get more comfortable analyzing that information, I think you're going to see utilities change the way they budget. I know you mentioned a little bit about the herbicide piece, and I think typically what we've heard is that many of the utilities have very small budgets for the danger trees outside of right-of-way trees and for herbicide. So those are usually the very, very small parts of the budget. And those are the ones you run out of first, right? So it could be quite a challenge with that.
We're pretty fortunate, and I think a lot of co-ops are in the same position. I mean, it's all about our member at the end of the day. We want to keep their lights on as much as possible. I know my management and our board has been very receptive to trying to let we've presented it this way is don't let the budget determine the tree trimming, let the condition of the trees determine the budget. And at the end of the day, I know that's a little bit of a very optimistic view, but that's how it should be approached, at least to start. You shouldn't just give up right out of the gate. You should say, this is what it's going to take to cut the trees, to mow the right of way, to spray the right of way, to inspect for danger trees, and present that number and present it in a fashion that has data that backs it up, and then let them make that decision on the budget. You present the budget that it takes and let them walk it back if they need to from a rate perspective or a cash flow perspective or whatever the drivers are. But I'm on the engineering and operations side. I want to do it right one time instead of having to go back. And that's another key selling point, is to say, if we don't do it, this is how it's going to hurt you. So it's either pay me now or pay me later. That the tree is going to get in the wire if it's growing into the wire. So you can either cut it on straight time with a contract crew, or you can send a line crew out there in the middle of the night to cut the tree off of it after it's already taken everybody out of power. So it's just really important to frame that conversation and that request for those budget items around what you need to get it done, and not necessarily don't start out the gate and just accept it. I'm just going to throw a number out there, a $2 million budget. If it's going to take $3 million, well, then ask for $3 million and make them tell you no. But what we found is that when we present the case and present the data that says this is what we need, and we present the outage numbers to back it up, to say, hey, these members have already experienced multiple interruptions based on tree outages, and it's getting worse, and you can see that trend in the data, then we found that our management and our board has been receptive to increasing our right-of-way budgets to get a handle on it better. So that would be my advice for people, is ask for the moon and get what you can get.
No, I think that's very insightful. And I think a couple of things I take away from that is the bottom up approach is always better than the top down, because it's based on data, right? And so you have information, you have goals, reliability goals, that your customer satisfaction, perhaps goals that you're trying to meet. And so having that bottom up approach will at least give the decision makers the information they need when it comes to budgets. And I think the other thing you said that rings so true is that you can pay me now or pay me later, right? You're gonna pay for that service one way or the other. And to your point, if it's an emergency type solution, then it's obviously going to cost you more.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's been great with our partnership for our right-of-way data. We have the ability to kind of overlay the grow-in risk on top of our entire system. So we can do when we do a presentation to the board or to our senior management, it's not just, well, Daniel wrote out the line and he says this needs to be trimmed. You can show them a picture that says, here, look at all the green, that's good, and then look at all the red, that's bad. And our plan is to attack this group of red, this group of red, and this group of red. And then it becomes more real. You can say, oh, that's the Grace Chapel area. I'm the board member that represents that. Yeah, we better spend the money on that section and get it done, because I don't want my neighbors complaining to me that their power went out last week at church. So, and I'm just being a little funny there, but that's the more you can take actual data and make a presentation and have a very organized cause, the number of tickets, the number of outages, overlaying what the right-of-way picture looks like on your circuit, overlaying your trim cycle to say, this is what we're doing. anything you can do to make it look like you've really put the effort into understanding your system and your data and presenting that, it's probably going to help drive that number in the correct direction for you. So take some time and do that would be my advice.
Yeah, that's very solid advice. And I think we've talked a lot about the automation of the collection of data, but to your last point there, just the analyzing of that data. I mean, there are platforms that will take that collected data in many formats and can quickly give you the results that you can then present in the manner that you described. So Jacob, we had a question come in about the right-of-way width. Can you describe or tell us a little bit about how much right-of-way width you have?
Yeah, so originally, our oldest easements specified 15 feet from center line, so 30 feet. But sometime in the late 40s, early 50s, I believe they switched to a 20-foot right of way on distribution and a 50-foot right of way on transmission. And generally that's 20 feet from center line, 50 feet from center line. So we have a 40-foot wide swath and a 100-foot wide swath. For the longest time, we were ground to sky, and there's a lot of debate on ground to sky versus just some kind of intermediate trimming. You do pay a premium to go ground to sky for sure. And we have a lot of tall trees here. So there's a lot of areas we still do a little bit of ground to sky trimming. And because of the height, it works out to, if I remember correctly, it's 70 feet is what we have. That's not in the easement. Easement wise, we have the ability to trim ground to sky, but from a operational and financial impact decision, we've decided to move to more of a 70-foot vertical clearance. But that's ours, and it works real well. I mean, when you see a nice, beautifully cut right away that's 40 feet wide, and you feel very good about that when you look at it, freshly trimmed section, and you look down that right away and you think, man, this is good. Like a tree's not going to hit this thing anytime soon. So that's ours. I know other people, I know in this area, Duke uses a 15-foot from center line, and it's variable for a lot of people. Like I said, the yard trees, we generally trim those down below the neutral. 1 to 2 feet below the neutral is where we target for those. Or if there's communication on the pole, we may take it down below the communication as well. One thing on that note, mentioning communication, I've never seen a communication crew trim a tree line, so they certainly rely on us. And I know you've all driven down the road and you can see that if a pole line is for comms only, I mean, they might as well just hang it on the trees in a lot of spots. But we're certainly leading the charge in keeping the right of way clean for not just us, but our joint use attachers as well. So they complain that we charge them too much, but we certainly do a lot of maintenance for them.
Yeah, I think that's a common complaint until they have to do it themselves, right? So Jacob, you talked about contractors going out and doing work. There are some challenges around making sure they did exactly what needed to be done. Can you tell me a little bit about what your quality assurance or your inspection processes look like and what results you found as it relates to that?
Yeah, so excuse me. We have specific supervisors that are assigned to basically manage the right-of-way crews. So it's also their responsibility to do the spot checking. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's something that as a utility person, you should live and die by. And it was an old warrant officer. I was in the Navy for 10 years. It was an old warrant officer that told me this, and it rang true in the Navy and it rings true in the utility industry is you get what you inspect, not what you expect. So we expect the right-of-way guys to go out there and trim and do everything perfect. But unless you're going behind them and inspecting that work, you are not necessarily going to get what you expected. And a lot of times you won't, right? They, for whatever reason, whether it was wet that day and they said, hey, we're going to come back to it tomorrow or next week when it dries up, and then it just gets lost off the radar. Or it could even be intentional to say, hey, we're going to try to save a little money. There's no way they're going to ride this part out. I like to think that it's a lot of unintentional, but either way, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. If the right-of-way section gets missed, it's missed. And that's a bad thing for the members, not just from a reliability standpoint, but also a financial standpoint, because you're paying a company to do this. And if they're not doing it, then you're not getting your money's worth out of that company. And a lot of times what I found is if you don't have an inspection program that kind of immediately goes behind them when they say that, hey, this has been done, then you run the risk of, if the contract changes hands and that crew goes off site, and let's say you have one company that cuts the trees, they missed a section. Now, if a new contract is in place and that company's gone off the system, you can forget about it. You're never going to get them to come back out and trim that section. You're just going to have to pay the new company to go back and trim it, or pay your T&E contractor to go back and trim it if it needs to be trimmed. So it's just something that is very important to inspect right away. It's affected by that proximity bias as well. It's easy to inspect the stuff that's out along the road. It's harder to inspect the stuff that goes down and then makes a 90-degree turn and you can't see it and you can't get a truck to it. So you have to get out and walk it. So it's just something it's got to be done. I'm excited. That's one of the more exciting things. When I first saw the satellite technology, one of the things that they mentioned was, hey, we'll be able to take a scan and let you know what got missed from a holistic standpoint. And that's one of my favorite parts of that technology, is it gives us a very clear picture on, did we do a good job of trimming what we said we were going to trim that year? So we've had those results come in, I think, one time, and then I'm about to get another set of results here in August. And I'm really looking forward to that. That's one of the things I'm most excited about with the new technology. And the same could be done with a drone inspection or even a walkout inspection. But if you have something that can basically take a snapshot of the whole system and say, yep, you did a good job trimming what you said you were going to trim, it just gives you a lot of peace of mind that things are working correctly.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. It's a game changer. And so you've identified some of those risks in terms of costs, right? The go backs and having to do it again if you have a different contractor. And then the other piece, which is implied in this, is that if they missed it, then the next time you have to go back, you've got more growth. And then I could argue that it will cost you more, just even from the planning perspective and getting it done. So it just adds additional cost to that overall cycle trim process in the future. So we're talking quite a bit about costs, what have you seen in terms of other economic challenges, I guess, for Randolph Electric? I know we read about inflation every day, but from a workforce perspective, maybe even some other cost-related issues. You talked a little bit about contracting already. Are there any other, I guess, economic indicators or challenges that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big factors, and if anybody on this call is involved in contract bidding, not just in the right-of-way realm, but even in just the line crew and line construction, all the contract rates are going up. The cost, the inflation or whatever's driving it on the macroeconomic scale is definitely hitting us on the micro scale pretty hard. And we're seeing it's good for some people, right? Because it's wage growth. There's real wage growth going on in the industry. So linemen are getting paid more now than they've ever been paid. And so that has an effect, though, where that's causing the contract cost to increase. We're seeing anywhere from a 25 to 50% increase in our contract labor costs. And the same thing, we're a little nervous. So the last time we bid out our right-of-way was 2 years ago. We're about to bid it out here again in August. And that's one of the things we've kind of prepared ourselves for, but I'm not looking forward to seeing that number come in. But we fully expect to see that wage growth and that contract cost inflation go up this time. And just how much it'll go up is kind of the mystery. And we'll find out here real soon, though. Like I said, in a couple of months, I'll have more solid numbers on that. But we're seeing it on every contract that we rebid. So there's really no doubt it's coming. Just the equipment cost. I don't know if people are involved in purchasing equipment, but even just if you go out and buy a new car on your own, most dealerships, you may have to pay above sticker price or sticker price. Whereas 5 years ago, you would always negotiate something below sticker price and you'd feel good about it. And they're still making money. But nowadays, if you're buying a bucket truck or a line truck or some large tree trimming piece of equipment, like the drafts or whatever, that equipment, their price is high and they're not budging at all. They're not letting you customize it. They're basically saying, we're going to build it to the factory spec and you either take it or we'll sell it to someone else. And the lead time's through the roof. So if you were to order one of those pieces of equipment today, it may be 2 or 3 years before you even get it. So that means that the equipment that they have, they're having to spend more money to maintain it, which again is driving that cost up. So something that's wore out and should be replaced. Well, now it's got to go 2 more years because you can't afford to retire it because you don't have a replacement to come in and do the work that needs to be done. So we're being hit from all directions. Material cost is going up on everything. Material lead time is high on everything. And so maybe on the tree trimming side, that's not really impacting us too much. But on the contract labor side for doing our work plan construction projects and stuff, that's having a big impact on our budget. And anytime the budget is being impacted, it starts that tightening process to say, where can we save? Where is there any fat that we can cut out? And I would say most utilities and co-ops, they're operating pretty lean to start with, so there's not just a bunch of fat sitting in the budget that's like, oh, well, we can cut this out and save money. But so they start looking at those large programs to say, hey, tree trimming is a large program. What can we save in that? And that goes back to, okay, so that's driving us to be more efficient. So we got to cut the same amount of trees. We got to identify the same number of problems, but we have to do it more efficiently now because we want to save that money, not just because of these budget cuts, but that's also good practice just anyway. So, and I guess budget cut's the wrong word. That increased expenditure, putting pressure on the budget is really what I meant.
Yep. No, I think that's pretty solid. And I do believe that is most utilities' experience. That's certainly what we've heard on the previous episodes of this. So Jacob, you mentioned earlier, I think, about the CDLs, right? You talked about moving crews and about these contractors not having workers that had their CDL licenses. And so that sort of suggests to me that there's a manpower type issue or certainly a skill type issue. And I wonder if it's just more than the driver. I mean, are you seeing your contract resources or perhaps even your own resources that have fewer years of experience than you've had in the past, and how that's challenging the work that needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, the utility industry, Randolph's no exception to this. Utility industry in general, I would say it's got an aging workforce issue that is being combated. We've made a lot of positive steps. We've hired a lot of younger employees now. And that's not to say that we're always looking for that experienced person that's out on the job market that brings a good skill set, but they're few and far between. So you end up having to hire inexperienced people. For us, we're hiring somebody, they don't have a CDL, they don't have any experience as a lineman. They may have gone to some kind of lineman school. They probably haven't. And so we're taking a bit of a risk on these people and training them, getting them their CDL and getting them their apprentice program, their training that they need to become a journeyman in the lineman field. And all the contract crews are doing the same thing. And it's the same thing with the tree right-of-way contractors as well. They're hiring people that are not really qualified and having to spend a large amount of resources training them to get them qualified. So it takes time to develop that workforce. And then the risk you run is when you develop that person, they may jump ship and find somewhere where they think the grass is greener on the other side and move on from you. But that's just part of it. But that goes back to that wage growth. And that's what's driving that wage growth is that, hey, people are trying to hold on to their good people. So that's causing them to increase their wages because of inflation's going up. And now that puts pressure on, again, the budgets and the contracts and all that stuff. But we're certainly seeing that on the right-of-way contractor side. It seems like CDL drivers are few and far between, and just getting and holding on to good labor and help is a challenge for all of them, for sure.
Yeah, and I think we're going to be in an interesting mix here pretty soon, where you're going to get your less experienced, younger workforce, and you'll still have your experienced workforce that are very seasoned and have all the knowledge about trees, about vegetation management, about your system. And then so you'll have this new group that's very embracing to the technology, and you'll have this other group that's just, they are the gurus of all things vegetation. And I think the companies that can find a way to really have them work together will be able to manage through this sort of transition until the newer folks can get up to speed. I think that's going to be the sort of the challenge in transitioning the workforce.
Yeah, and I've always found that it's always interesting. You got that person that's been there forever, and you always say like, man, it's going to be tough when that guy retires. but it always seems like somebody steps up to the plate and takes on that workload. And it just means that somebody else is given their chance to shine and develop and become a more integral part of the team. And I think the utility industry is great for that. I think we put a lot of effort into trying to develop our personnel, give them opportunities to see different things. And that way, when somebody does retire, they have at least some of the skills to go ahead and step into that role, and then support them when they're in that role to help bring them completely up to speed on where they need to be. So we're all on the same team. The utility industry is great for helping each other out. Just even events like this where we come and just share different information and insights on how we do. I don't know how many industries do that, but I go to a lot of conferences and I go to a lot of different meetings and just mutual aid in general during storms, the supply chain issues we have. We all support the storms even in other areas. So we may not get a load of poles this week because they all went down to Louisiana or to Texas or wherever because they had a big storm and they need that material. But the same thing would happen for us is if a hurricane hit North Carolina and we needed that material, our suppliers would divert it from people to help us out as well. So there's just a big idea and concept and willingness to share information, share processes, share what works, share what doesn't work in the utility industry. And that's one of the great things about working in this industry.
Absolutely. I'll tell you, the one thing I do miss the most about being retired is the people. And so engagements like this I find to be very beneficial, and I still enjoy doing that. I always love hearing about the stories of people in other areas. We have a lot in common, as you said, but we obviously have things that are very different based on terrain and some other factors around regulations and requirements, right? And so, Jacob, I just want to thank you today for coming on and sharing with us all your experience in that area. And I'm going to check with Eric. Eric, are there any questions that we left unanswered, or is there anything that you might want to share with them as it relates to how they might be able to get a copy of this segment?
Sure, yeah, no further questions, but you will get a recording shortly after the show. You can also find recordings from all the other past shows on ai-.com.
I appreciate it. Jacob, any final parting words for us?
No, I just appreciate the time. And I mean, I think my contact information's in there. Or so if anybody has any questions or wants more information or wants to just chat offline, feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Perfect. You've been great, Jacob. Thanks again for your time. Take care, everyone.